Have you ever stepped into a room in where every glance said, "You don't belong here," where silence wasn't peaceful but judging, where your seat was waiting but the world around you acted like it wasn't yours to claim? What would you do if someone looked at you not as a person but as a mistake that walked in? This is not a story about a flight. It's not even just a story about discrimination. It's a story about what happens when one woman stays seated when everything around her demands she stand down. Her name is Celeste Morgan. She's a single mom, a woman of quiet strength. And on a Tuesday morning, she boarded a luxury flight from Los Angeles to New York with nothing more than a phone, a slim laptop bag, and a resolve not to be moved. What happened next, no one saw coming. Not the woman who insulted her, not the passengers who looked away, not even the captain of the plane. But what if I told you that the woman being judged was the one who had designed the very rules others tried to use against her? What if the person told to move to the back was the reason this airline existed in the first place? Before this flight touched down, one career would collapse, an entire cabin would awaken, and the world would be reminded why respect is not a luxury, it's a right. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear isn't just a confrontation, it's a turning point. A moment when dignity sat down and prejudice stood exposed. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment a woman walked into a first-class cabin and the world around her flinched. The luxury cabin was nearly silent. Thick carpet muffled every footstep, and the soft jazz from the overhead speakers made everything feel curated. Perfectly stitched leather seats, hand-stitched monograms, glasses already chilled waiting to be filled with vintage champagne. It was a world where nothing seemed out of place, where everything and everyone had a role, a price tag, a dress code. And then she walked in. No makeup team, no assistant dragging her luggage behind, just a tall black woman in her 30s wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit flats instead of heels and a laptop bag tucked neatly under her arm. Her name was Celeste Morgan, but no one knew that yet. She didn't smile broadly. She didn't try to prove she belonged. She simply walked, calm, steady, intentional, and stopped at seat 1A. Some passengers glanced up, then looked away. A few blinked twice, but no one said a word, except for one. The head flight attendant, Lauren Briggs, had been greeting every passenger like royalty until now. When Celeste stepped forward, there was no welcome aboard, only a cold, clipped remark. "Hello, I hope you're not lost." Celeste looked up, not with confrontation, not even sarcasm, just a quiet pause, a gentle nod, and then she continued walking. She sat down, smoothly, deliberately, as if the seat had been made for her, and in some ways it had. But in the minds of a few around her, the silent question had already formed. Who does she think she is? This is a moment many people never notice unless they've lived it. It's not always loud, not always direct, but it's there, in the subtle stiffness of a steward's smile, in the way someone clutches their bag just a little tighter, in the silence that fills a space when you enter it and people don't expect you to be there. If you've never felt it, you're lucky. If you have, you know exactly what Celeste felt that morning. It reminds me of something a friend once told me, a woman who was the first black female partner at a prestigious law firm in Chicago. She said, "Every time I walked into a boardroom, I could feel the air change. Like my presence was a question mark." That's what this moment was. Celeste wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't loud. She wasn't late. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She was simply there in a seat many believed she hadn't earned. But she didn't flinch, didn't adjust herself to fit their discomfort. She sat down anyway. And that's where this story truly begins. Because what Celeste didn't say, what she didn't need to say, was that she knew exactly where she was sitting. She didn't just belong there, she helped build it. But for now, she chose to remain quiet, to let others show who they were before she revealed who she was. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a world full of assumptions is simply stay seated, even when they look at you like you don't belong, especially then. Lauren Briggs had perfected her smile. It was the kind that looked flawless in company training videos, chin-lifted teeth showing warm but controlled. She had worked for Right Skies Airlines for almost 10 years, and in that time she'd mastered the subtle art of serving first class like a stage performance. But there's a kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, a smile that stretches the lips but tightens the air. That was the smile she gave Celeste Morgan. It wasn't the kind of frown that gets you called out. It wasn't hostile, but it was sharp enough to say, "You're not supposed to be here." She didn't need to check Celeste's ticket. She didn't ask for her name. She just blocked the aisle with a hand on her hip and said, "This area is for priority passengers only." Celeste stayed still, calm. She quietly turned her phone screen, showing the digital boarding pass with seat 1A, first class clearly displayed. And then she replied gently, "And I am one of those passengers." Lauren didn't look at the screen. She didn't even blink. It's easy to think discrimination always looks like shouting or slurs. But sometimes, it wears mascara clips on a name tag and says, "I'm just following protocol." What Lauren was following wasn't the official handbook. It was an unwritten rule, one not taught but absorbed over time. If someone doesn't look like they belong in first class, assume they don't. And that's the danger of rules we don't talk about. They live in glances. They speak through silence. They punish without needing a policy. I once heard a story about a black doctor, head of cardiology at a major hospital, who was stopped by security while trying to enter a conference room at a luxury hotel. He wasn't wearing a lab coat. He was in jeans and a sweater. And that was enough. They asked him if he was here to deliver something. His only mistake. Not looking like he belonged in a place where lives were being saved by people like him every day. Back on the plane, Lauren's words sharpened. "I don't remember seeing your name on the list." Still, she didn't open her logbook. Still, she didn't call anyone to check. She didn't need to, because in her mind, Celeste's skin, her calm, her flats all said more than a name ever could. And here's the part many people overlook. Lauren wasn't just enforcing a policy. She was defending a system where familiarity and appearances feel safer than truth. Where power isn't about procedures, it's about who's seen as worthy of grace and who must constantly prove their presence. Some rules don't need to be written to be enforced, and the most dangerous systems are the ones we enforce, without ever questioning where they came from. Celeste didn't raise her voice. She didn't back down either. She simply looked Lauren in the eye and said, "Perhaps you should check the list again," before jumping to conclusions. But Lauren didn't. Instead, she made a decision that would cost her more than she could have imagined. She raised her voice and threatened to call security. That's when something shifted. Because in that cabin, what started as a smile of control was about to become a public act of judgment. And Celeste. She wasn't going anywhere. Celeste didn't raise her voice. She didn't push back. She didn't call for help. She just sat there, still centered like a mountain planted in the middle of a storm. The cabin around her began to tense. Lauren, the flight attendant, stood tall like a gatekeeper. Her voice louder now, clear enough for the nearby rows to hear. "If you don't move to your seat in economy, I will call security." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. A couple of them exchanged glances the way people do when they sense drama but aren't sure if they should intervene. Most said nothing. Celeste looked up slowly. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It was barely above a whisper, but it carried with it the weight of a decision. "Call if you feel the need." 6 words, that's all. But in that moment, it was as if the cabin tilted, because it was no longer just about a seat. It was about a woman who had been told, like so many others before her, to go back where she came from, but who chose to stay seated. A young man 2 rows back scoffed. "If she's not supposed to be there, why not just move? Why make it a thing?" Another passenger, a woman in pearls and designer glasses, murmured, "Maybe it's one of those automatic upgrade people." But Daniel, a man in a charcoal gray suit, said nothing. He just watched, eyes sharp, thoughtful. He hadn't spoken yet, but something in his posture shifted, like he was waiting, listening for the moment when silence became complicity. We often think courage looks like shouting, but sometimes courage is quiet. It's a refusal, a stillness. Years ago, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. That single act of defiance helped ignite a civil rights movement. She didn't yell. She didn't push. She simply said no. And just like that, history moved. Celeste's no wasn't just for herself. It was for the invisible weight on every black woman who had ever been asked to make themselves smaller, to step aside, to wait, to be grateful for just being allowed. But that day she didn't wait. She didn't stand. She stayed seated because she had nothing to prove. And that's what unsettled everyone the most. You see, when someone refuses to react the way you expect, it throws off the balance. Lauren expected anger. She expected resistance. She expected someone to crack under pressure, but Celeste didn't. She withheld the reaction, and that alone was enough to shake the room. Sometimes the most powerful form of protest is simply not moving, not when they expect you to scream, but when they expect you to give up. Lauren, still standing, gave a sharp signal to her junior flight attendant, Grace. "Move her to the back, now." Grace hesitated. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held the passenger list. Right there at the very top, Celeste Morgan, confidential priority status in bold letters. She looked at Celeste, then at Lauren, then back at the list. She didn't move. The cabin held its breath. And then a voice broke the silence. It wasn't Celeste's. It was Daniel, the man in the gray suit. He stood calm and firm. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Lauren, "I think you should check the list again before insulting someone in front of the entire cabin." Lauren froze. "Don't you see where she's from?" she snapped, then instantly regretted it. The moment the words left her lips, the room shifted. That's when everyone saw it. This wasn't about a mistake. This wasn't about a boarding pass. This was about something else entirely. Bias, judgment, power misused. Celeste sat still. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't cry. She simply looked up and asked the question that no one expected. "I am in the right place, Miss Briggs. And you? Where are you?" A simple sentence. But it cut through every thread of false authority like a blade of truth. It began with a tray of water. Nothing dramatic. Just bottled water and glasses on a silver tray, gently swaying as Lauren walked down the aisle. She had calmed herself, or so it seemed. After being publicly questioned, her voice returned to professional mode. Her posture regained composure. But inside, something had cracked. And cracks, when ignored, don't disappear. They deepen. As she neared Celeste's seat, something in her movements changed. She shifted deliberately, just slightly, enough to bump her leg into Celeste's outstretched foot and tilt the tray so that 3 glasses of water spilled directly onto Celeste's lap. A splash, a gasp, the tinkle of glass, and then silence. Lauren gasped theatrically. "You put your foot in the way and spilled everything." Several heads turned. Mrs. Thompson nearly dropped her knitting. A man in business class muttered under his breath, "Is this still about the seat?" Megan, the stylish woman with the designer glasses, clicked her tongue in disapproval. What a mess. But in the middle of it all, Celeste didn't flinch. She calmly looked down at her damp slacks, reached for a napkin, dabbed the water away, then slowly lifted her head and said, "You did that on purpose." Her voice wasn't angry, not even accusing. It was just certain. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lauren snapped, "What did you say?" Celeste repeated even more softly. "You did that on purpose. And all I ask is to be treated with the same respect as everyone else on this flight." That's when Grace, the younger flight attendant, froze completely, because she had seen everything. The bump, the tilt, the coldness behind the gesture. And suddenly it was clear this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a moment when judgment turned into action. And when that action hurt someone, it became something else entirely. Violence. Violence doesn't always look like fists. Sometimes it's in how water is spilled, how someone is humiliated in front of others, how power is used not to protect but to punish. I remember reading about a young black student in a university cafeteria who was accused of stealing food. He was holding a tray, had his student ID, but the security guard didn't ask, he assumed. And when the student resisted the false accusation, he was pinned down. Later, the university apologized, but that student, he dropped out the following semester. Why not because of grades, but because the cafeteria, a place to eat, had become a place of fear. On the plane, Celeste didn't react with rage. She simply looked at Lauren, not with hate, not even with sadness, just clarity. That look, that silence. It was more powerful than any outburst. And maybe that's why Lauren panicked. Because silence doesn't let you hide. It reflects you back to yourself. Without warning, Lauren stepped forward. 2 quick strides, and then a slap. Sharp, sudden, loud. It echoed like thunder through the stillness of the cabin. Passengers gasped. Someone let out a small scream. Even Megan, who had watched the whole thing like a live drama, now sat bolt upright, her mouth slightly open. Grace raised a trembling hand to her lips. Daniel stood up, fists clenched, and Celeste. She sat still. Her face stung. A red handprint bloomed on her cheek, but she didn't touch it. She just slowly turned back to face Lauren, eyes steady, voice calm, and she said, "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life. When we let prejudice guide our actions, we don't just harm others, we reveal the worst parts of ourselves. And sometimes, the whole world is watching." Daniel finally stepped forward, his voice firm and deliberate. "Miss Briggs, you've assaulted a passenger in front of multiple witnesses," Lauren stammered. I didn't mean, but no excuse could undo the sound of that slap, or the eyes now turning toward her, not with admiration, but judgment. Grace finally spoke, her voice shaking, but true, Miss Morgan didn't do anything wrong. She only asked to be respected, and that's when the tone shifted completely. Because when violence becomes visible, undeniable, there's no going back. People wake up. Truth stands tall, and even silence can't protect those who abuse power. Captain Ross entered the cabin, his face tight. "We've received instructions from upper management," he announced. "The owner of this aircraft is on board." Every head turned. Lauren's face went pale. And then the words that would end her career: "Miss Celeste Morgan is the CEO and founder of Right Skies Airlines." At 36,000 feet in the air, inside a pressurized steel tube, something unthinkable had just happened. A woman had been slapped, not in an alley, not in a back room, but in first class, in full view of passengers, attendants, and crew. And for the first time on that flight, silence wasn't indifference. It was shock. It was people holding their breath because something had crossed the line. No one could look away now. Megan Sinclair, who'd earlier whispered judgments behind designer sunglasses, slowly lowered them. Daniel Green remained standing, his jaw tight, like a man witnessing a courtroom being formed out of upholstery and aisle rugs. Mrs. Thompson reached for her husband's hand, her knitting yarn dropping to the floor, and Grace Young, trembling honest, took a step forward. Celeste didn't move. She didn't need to. The weight of truth had already shifted. And Lauren, she stood alone in the aisle, uniformed yet suddenly exposed. Captain Ross had just announced that Celeste wasn't just a passenger. She was the owner of the aircraft, the founder of the airline, the woman whose name appeared at the top of every internal code of conduct Lauren had once been trained to follow. The cabin had changed. Just moments before, it was a luxury space with curated service and rehearsed politeness. Now it was a courtroom where the jury wasn't 12 people, but everyone on board. No one had asked to be part of it, but they were already seated, already witnessing. It reminded me of a story from a high school in Alabama. A teacher, quiet and principled, was reprimanded for defending a student who'd been unfairly targeted by a vice principal. She didn't yell. She didn't protest. She simply wrote a letter, then read it aloud during the next staff meeting. And when she did, silence fell. Then chairs creaked. Then one by one, other teachers stood, some in support, some in guilt. The room had changed, not because of the letter, but because the silence had finally broken. On the plane, something similar happened. Daniel turned to the rest of the cabin and spoke, not like a lawyer, not like a businessman, but like a man who'd had enough. "This isn't about airline status. It's about basic decency. And we've all been sitting here watching it unfold." He didn't accuse. He included himself. "We should have said something sooner." It was a simple sentence, but it pierced the atmosphere like light through fog. And then, like flickers of conscience, reigniting voices joined in. "I thought something felt off from the start." She didn't raise her voice once. She showed her ticket. Why didn't they check even misses? Thompson whispered, half to herself, half to the cabin. "We all saw it. We just didn't want to be the first to speak." Silence is rarely neutral. In moments of injustice, silence sides with the aggressor, not the victim. And when we say nothing, we give our quiet permission. Grace finally stepped beside Celeste. Not out of obligation, but out of something deeper alignment. She looked toward Lauren and spoke, her voice steadier. This time I saw what happened. And Miss Morgan didn't do anything wrong. Then she turned toward the passengers. She was humiliated, then assaulted, and we all witnessed it. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just that shared weight in the air of accountability settling in. Lauren tried to speak. I didn't know who she was. But that wasn't the point anymore. Because the question wasn't who Celeste was. It was why she had to be someone important to be treated with respect. And that's when Celeste finally stood. Not to retaliate, not to reclaim power, but to remind the room of something we all forget. It shouldn't matter if I'm the CEO or a single mother flying home after a hard week. Everyone deserves dignity, no matter who they are. That single sentence shifted the cabin again, because in that moment Celeste stopped being a CEO in a suit. She became every person who'd ever been judged silenced or made to feel small in a space they had every right to occupy. The first person to break the silence isn't just a witness, they're a mirror reflecting back the truths others tried to ignore. And now, as the aircraft prepared to make an unscheduled landing, as protocol officers awaited at the terminal, as Lauren stood facing consequences she never saw coming, Celeste prepared for something far bigger than accountability. She was about to begin rebuilding the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. When the captain uttered those 12 words, Miss Celeste Morgan is the CEO and founder of Right Skies Airlines, the cabin didn't erupt. It hushed, like something sacred had just been spoken. Some passengers looked stunned, others ashamed. Lauren, who once stood firm and commanding, suddenly seemed small. But Celeste, she didn't puff her chest, didn't announce I told you so. She simply stood taller. Not because of her title, but because she had carried herself with grace long before anyone knew who she was. You see, real integrity isn't a reaction. It's a constant. It doesn't wait for recognition. It walks in quietly and stays the course even when no one is watching. Celeste had spent much of her life being underestimated. Born in a working-class neighborhood in Baltimore, raised by a mother who worked double shifts and reminded her every night, respect yourself even when the world doesn't. She didn't attend Ivy League schools. She worked part-time through community college. And she built her business from a borrowed laptop at a public library. There were days she ate dinner from vending machines, nights she rocked her infant daughter to sleep in laundromats. But she kept going, not because someone was clapping, but because she believed in building something that treated people better. When she launched Right Skies Airlines, it wasn't to chase luxury. It was to create a space in the air where no one had to prove their worth. Where being treated well wasn't a perk, it was the baseline. She once told a room full of interns, "Our job isn't to serve status, it's to serve people." That belief, it became the soul of the company. But in that cabin, Lauren had forgotten it. Or perhaps, never believed it in the first place. And that's why the title CEO wasn't the real revelation. The real shock was realizing that a woman who had been so deeply disrespected was the same woman who had quietly set the standard everyone else was failing to follow. Titles can command a room, but character commands respect even in silence. I remember a story about a janitor in a Chicago school district who broke up a fight between students. He wasn't trained in conflict resolution. He didn't carry a whistle or a badge, but he saw the fear in the kids' eyes and acted. Later, when asked why he stepped in, he simply said, "You don't need a title to do what's right. You just need a moment and the courage to take it." That's what Celeste represented in that cabin. Not just authority, but earned respect. She didn't speak more loudly once her identity was known. She didn't punish anyone publicly. She simply held up a mirror and let the truth do the talking. Who you are when no one knows your name is who you truly are. And the world doesn't need more people with power. It needs more people who remember why they have it. As Celeste turned away from Lauren, calm, measured, unshaken, she didn't look back. She had nothing to prove. The facts had spoken. And now, it was time for action. Because integrity means more than responding with dignity. It also means fixing the systems that let disrespect thrive. Celeste knew this wasn't just about her seat. It wasn't even just about that flight. It was about the structure behind it. And so she made a choice. It was just one slap, one palm, one moment, but it traveled farther than the plane ever could. By the time Flight WS-472 made its emergency landing on a private runway in upstate New York, news had already begun to spread. It started small. A tweet from Daniel Green just witnessed a CEO get slapped by her own staff. This is what grace under pressure looks like. Then came a cell phone video from the back row. Then a blurry photo of Celeste with a red mark on her cheek. Then came the headlines, CEO assaulted in first-class cabin. Airline confirms internal review. When bias boards first, the flight that made everyone pay attention. And just like that, the slap became a symbol. Not because it was the most violent act, but because it revealed what so many had been quietly enduring. Not every injustice leaves a bruise. Some leave silence. Some leave resignation. Some leave a bitter memory of being treated less than just because you didn't look like you belonged. Celeste didn't use that moment to gain sympathy. She used it to create structure. 3 days after the incident, she called an executive meeting, not in the boardroom, but in the airline's employee training center. There were no suits, no title cards. Just a whiteboard with 6 words written in bold: respect isn't optional, it's policy. Then she laid out a plan, not a PR campaign, not a scripted apology, a complete overhaul of Right Skies Airlines' service culture, mandatory 8-week bias training for all customer-facing staff. A new 24/7 anonymous reporting platform called Dignity Line. Real-time dashboard monitoring of complaints visible to executive leadership. Zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, no matter the rank. She ended the meeting with a quiet promise. If we want to fly high, we can't leave our conscience on the runway. But the impact didn't stop there. Other airlines began to notice. First came West Coast Wings, then Polaris Jet, then international carriers like Skynova. Each announced similar reforms, some out of genuine introspection, others out of public pressure. But either way, the standard had shifted. For decades, the airline industry had clung to an old unspoken rule. Luxury is reserved. Service is selective. But now people were beginning to ask, reserved for whom, selective by what measure? In a business school in Atlanta, a professor paused mid-lecture and rewrote that week's case study, Forget the Fortune 500 mergers, she said. This is the kind of leadership we should be studying. A high school teacher in Boston printed out Celeste's quote and pinned it to the bulletin board above her desk. Respect is not a reward. It's a basic right. And in a classroom in Dallas, a 12-year-old girl raised her hand and said, I want to be like her. She didn't yell, but she changed the rules. Real change doesn't always come from shouting. Sometimes it starts with holding your ground, even when they try to push you out of your seat. And sometimes, the person who gets slapped doesn't fall. They rise and lift others with them. Celeste never asked to become a symbol, but symbols don't get to choose their moment. They earn it through clarity, courage, and consistency. And this moment, it wasn't about revenge, it was about reform. As Celeste reviewed the first wave of policy changes from her quiet office 2 weeks later, her assistant brought her a stack of letters. Dozens. From passengers, from flight attendants, from people who said nothing that day but had felt everything. One letter simply read, "Thank you for not leaving that plane quietly." And Celeste knew this wasn't just about Right Skies. This was about every space where someone's dignity is weighed against their appearance. And now it was time to redesign those spaces, not just with better seats or softer lighting, but with values that couldn't be bought and couldn't be violated without consequence. By the time the last report was filed, by the time the headlines faded and the applause ended, Celeste found herself sitting alone in a quiet cabin. Same seats, same windows, but everything felt different because now she wasn't looking at seat numbers or boarding zones. She was seeing people, and behind every seat she realized there was a story no one else had bothered to ask. There's the elderly man in 3C. He just buried his wife of 41 years and was flying home alone for the first time. There's the teenage girl in 8A, wearing borrowed clothes, nervous about an audition that could change her life. There's the nurse in scrubs in the middle row, flying on a standby after a 14-hour shift. No one gave her a second glance. And there was Celeste, a CEO in a navy blue suit, but still in the eyes of many, just another woman who looked out of place. The thing about flying is everyone is moving, but not everyone is seen. We assign value through tiny cues, the brand of their shoes, the way they carry their bag, the color of their skin, the cut of their jacket. But behind each seat, there's a life, a reason, a journey. We just forget to ask. Celeste once told her daughter a story about a time she was denied entry to a five-star hotel lobby. Not because she was rude, not because she didn't have a reservation, but because she walked in wearing jeans holding her daughter's lunchbox trying to escape a rainstorm. The concierge didn't ask her name. He simply said, "Ma'am, this entrance is for guests only." She didn't argue. She didn't push back. She turned around and stood in the rain, soaking wet with a crying child and a dignity she refused to drop. We judge fastest when we see the least, and yet what we don't see is often what matters most. On her desk at headquarters now sits a single photo. It's not of awards, not of planes. It's a photo taken quietly after the flight, the cabin still half lit with Grace the young flight attendant standing beside Celeste. No titles, no uniforms, just two women, one learning, one leading, and a simple caption engraved beneath, "See people, not positions." Letters continued to arrive. A teenage boy from Detroit wrote, "I didn't know someone like me could fly first class until I saw you." An elderly woman from Arizona said, "Your story reminded me of the time I was ignored in a hospital hallway because they assumed I was just visiting. I was the doctor." A flight attendant from another airline wrote, "I've served thousands of passengers, but I'm ashamed to admit I only truly saw a few." There's a reason Celeste kept every one of those letters, not to frame them, but to remind herself that leadership isn't about being at the front of the plane. It's about remembering the stories behind every seat. A small but powerful lesson. Kindness should never depend on perception, and respect should never be a reward. Because if we wait for someone to look deserving before we treat them with dignity, we miss who they really are, and we lose who we're supposed to be. As Celeste prepared to board her next flight, she didn't carry a title. She carried a truth that what happened that day wasn't just a one-time incident. It was a reflection of all the moments society has overlooked and all the quiet stories we've ignored. But not anymore. Celeste Morgan could have stopped at the apology. She could have released a statement, suspended the employee, offered compensation to passengers who felt uncomfortable, moved on. That's what companies usually do. They say the right things. They wait for the news cycle to move on. And they hope people forget. But Celeste knew respect shouldn't be a press release. It should be a promise. And not just a promise whispered in marketing, but one built into the way things work. So instead of writing a script, she rewrote the system. Right Skies Airlines didn't just apologize. They redesigned respect. Every customer-facing employee from flight attendants to lounge staff now goes through an 8-week immersive course, not the usual diversity module with tired stock photos and buzzwords. This was different. It was built with psychologists, behavioral scientists, and real passengers who had faced discrimination. The training didn't ask, "How should we treat people?" It asked, "Why do we treat some people better than others?" The answers were uncomfortable and necessary. Flight attendants were asked to reflect on their unconscious biases, to write down moments they may have acted differently toward passengers without realizing it, to role-play situations with instructors who challenged their instincts. It wasn't easy. Some cried, some quit, but those who stayed, they changed. Celeste launched Dignity Line, a 24/7 anonymous reporting system, not just for customers, but for employees too. Every report of bias, disrespect, or abuse is logged in a central dashboard. No more lost in HR. No more, "We'll look into it." Supervisors are trained to respond with urgency and transparency. Patterns are flagged automatically. Managers are held responsible. One employee said, "It used to feel like no one would listen. Now we're expected to speak up." Celeste introduced a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. No long reviews, no drawn-out investigations that quietly disappear. If the evidence is clear, the action is swift, and most importantly, public. Why? Because change doesn't happen in secret. It happens when a company is willing to say, "This is who we are, and this is who we will no longer be." These reforms didn't just earn applause, they set a new standard. Other companies began to ask, what would it look like if we did the same? Hotels, tech firms, retail chains, even schools. All watching one airline say respect is not earned by appearance. It's insured by policy. In a seminar at Stanford, Celeste spoke to a group of future CEOs. One student asked, "What's the hardest part of leading a company through change?" Celeste paused, then smiled. Knowing the difference between fixing your image and fixing your values. You don't need to be in charge of a company to make change. You just need to ask yourself, what am I normalizing? What am I tolerating? Because if we only demand fairness after a scandal, we're not building integrity, we're just managing damage. Celeste didn't wait for public pressure. She acted because she knew an apology without structure is just noise. But policy backed by conscience, that's how you build trust that lasts. And so with systems in place and trust slowly returning, Celeste prepared for the most important part of all, to speak directly to those watching, listening, waiting, to share what it all truly meant. Not as a CEO, but as a human being who had been told she didn't belong and chose to stay anyway. When Celeste Morgan stepped off flight WS-472, she didn't look back. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows on the runway. The wind caught the hem of her navy blazer, the same one still damp from spilled water just hours earlier. But now every step she took was quiet power. Not because she had won anything, but because she had refused to lose herself. She didn't exit the flight with cameras flashing, no triumphant music, no fanfare, just calm. A calm born from standing her ground, not to humiliate someone, not to make a scene, but to say gently and clearly, you don't get to decide who I am because I already have. Celeste didn't need to slam the door on Lauren Briggs. She simply closed it, with dignity, and sometimes that's even louder. Before boarding the waiting SUV, she paused. The cabin behind her had fallen still, but inside something had shifted. Passengers who once whispered in discomfort now sat in thoughtful silence. A few cried, others reflected. One woman reached for her phone not to scroll, but to call her daughter and say, "I saw something important today." Celeste didn't just leave a seat behind, she left a mirror and asked everyone to look into it. That night in a quiet room at her hotel, Celeste did something simple. She called her daughter. "Hi, baby, I'm home safe. How was the flight, Mama?" It was important. Then she paused and added, "Just remember, if someone ever tries to make you feel small, you don't have to shout. You just have to stay steady, and they'll hear you anyway." The strongest voice doesn't always rise in anger. Sometimes it rises in presence, in staying seated when the world tells you to move, in saying I deserve to be here without needing anyone's permission. 2 days later, the photo of Celeste stepping off the plane, hair pulled back, eyes steady, was framed and placed inside Right Sky's headquarters. But not as a branding moment, as a reminder of a woman who was told to move but stayed, who was underestimated but uplifted others, who had every reason to walk away, but instead chose to rebuild. And maybe the greatest thing she did was not standing up to power. It was standing with those who have none and saying, "This seat is mine, and it can be yours too." And now a question for you. If you were in that cabin, would you have said something? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have stood not in front of injustice, but beside the one facing it? Because here's the truth. This isn't just about Celeste. It's about every space we enter, every moment we witness, every time we are given a chance to either pass by or pause and speak. So the next time you board a flight or walk into a room, look around. Behind every seat is a story. And in every story, there's a moment where one person's quiet courage can lift an entire world higher. What would you do in that moment? We'd love to hear your voice. If this story moved you, share or comment below. Because sometimes the greatest change begins not with a speech, but with someone who simply refused to move.